Hi everyone, this is Sudhendra Singh from Coding Ninjas. In this video, we are going to learn about Angular. Now, what is Angular? Angular is a JavaScript framework for developing single-page application. Now, what is a framework? Frameworks are the set of tools or functions which we use to develop application and speed up our development. We'll be further looking on what is a single-page application and how do we develop a single page application. Now, without wasting any further time, let's see what are we going to learn in this video series. So in this video series, we are going to see about introduction to Angular. Then we'll move to installation and project structure. We'll be talking about components. Components are basic building blocks of any UI, and Angular supports component based modular application. We'll also talk about directives. Now, directives are functions which helps us manipulating our functions or classes and use them in a different manner. Then we'll be moving to CLI tutorial, how to use the command line interface in order to develop Angular application. Angular CLI provides multiple options in which we can generate pre-built components, templates, and even services. Then we'll be moving to data binding. Data binding will consist how our template or HTML interacts with our rest of the application, how we can pass data to the template, how we can receive data from the template and provide dynamicness in our page. Furthermore, we'll be moving to routing. Routing is exactly separating our complete application in different pages. For example, if we have a website, we have different pages. We have an about section, we have a context section and other different pages. The next is Angular forms. Here we will be discussing how we can receive input from the user along with the form and provide access to it. Submitting. The example of form can be maybe we are just registering on some website or logging in some website. Finally, we have something called as services. Now, services are basically the functions which we create for our overall application. For example, if we want to have a search service from a list that we want to search an item from, we can create a service for that, so that in our complete application, whenever we require searching any data from a list, we do not need to create the same function again and again, thus providing modularity in our code. Modularity is approach to develop a code which can be shared along the application, and even we can share in different projects across the projects too. Finally, we will be creating an Angular CRUD application. Now, CRUD is create, read, update, delete, and we'll be seeing how these function. Now, these are this lecture will be containing 10 videos, which includes all these topics. Now, without taking any further time, let's see what is Angular. Angular is a JavaScript framework for developing single page application. Now, single page applications are such applications where we have. Now, let's talk about what is a single page application and how it is different from our traditional HTML pages. So, this diagram is a representation of how a traditional web app works and how an Angular application would be working. Now, traditional web app, whenever the browser makes a request to the server, now server is someone who is going to supply us or give us the HTML pages when we request from our browser. So any URL, let's say we go to google.com, so it is supplying some pages to us or some HTML pages get downloaded into the browser. Now, website could have, let's say, a home page. So when the request for home page is sent to the server is responding back with a new home page, that is the HTML page containing CSS and JavaScript pages too. Again, if I try to go to any other page, let's say about page, so there is a next request coming to the server, and again a new HTML page is sent back to the browser. Now, every time for every different request for every different URL, a new HTML file is being sent to the client. Whereas the things are a bit changed when we talk about Angular. Whenever Angular requests for a page from the server, there's a single HTML page. So there's HTML page which is being served to the browser. Now, For further calls, let's say if we want to go to about page, or let's say we want to go to contact page, this time instead of loading a new HTML page, what single page application does is the content is being supplied or sent back to the client. Now the HTML page remains same, the content of that page changes. This reduces overhead of sending HTML file again and again, which is not required at the time. So only contents can be shared to this file. Now, furthermore, we have now let's talk about development history of Angular. Angular was developed by Google in year 2010. The name was AngularJS at that time. Now it came up with really cool features that traditional HTML ways were lacking at that point of time, providing modularity, single page application and other several features. It became quite popular that time till in year 2016 when React, AmberJS, these kind of libraries or frameworks popped up for building you, which became quite popular, setting up a good benchmark result than Angular used to be. So Angular decided to upgrade its version to Angular 2, and till now the current version which is being released is Angular 15. So we have an updates after every 6 months from year 2016, coming with lots of cool features we have. So let's talk about some of the Angular features. Some of the Angular features are modularity, reusability, TypeScript and ES6 support, speed and performance, packages and native app development. Modularity means dividing our complete UI code in several modules. Modules are building blocks of our application. For example, if I take an example of the website itself, which is the Angular documentation website, I see that this is the sidebar, this is the main section, and this is the navbar. Module code says that we can define all these navbar, main section and sidebar in a different modules along with the UI and their functionalities, and it can be treated as a separate component, finally combining all of them in the UI. Furthermore, we also have a reusability. Now, since the code is modular, the sidebar can be used in multiple pages. We can have the sidebar for the home page, we can have the sidebar for the main page, maybe the contact page and other different pages. Now, speed and performance. As we talked about, Angular offers single page application. So for creating different application, we do not need a separate HTML files. There would be a single HTML file or a template, and for every new page we want, the content or data can be shared and the same can be applied to the template, giving it less overhead. Instead of having separate HTML pages every time, we are just sharing the data or the part of the page which needs to be changed. Then we have packages. Angular framework has pre-built packages for most of the functionalities. If you want to implement a form, we already have a function for that. Search functionalities, any UI changes. For example, there is a styling library, Bootstrap out there, which can be directly used to have styling components like buttons, drop downs and other things in our website. It also offers native app development. Now, native app development, we can create mobile application using Angular. The combination of the native code and our Angular code. Now, talking about the prerequisites of Angular. In order to get started with Angular, we should be having basic knowledge of JavaScript. We should be knowing about the functions, a bit of classes, then how browser APIs like promises, async, await, these things work. Then we have basics of Node.js and package manager. So we should be knowing what is Node.js and what is the Node package manager, and basics of web development including HTML, CSS and JavaScript, which we already talked about. Now, moving on, we can see an example of this Coding Ninjas website, which is the content page, and it's also developed in Angular. So we can see that when we say modularity, or we say that our Angular app design our application in component based. So we can separate our complete pages in different components. For example, if I see this page, I can separate that. I can separately develop this leaderboard. I can separately develop this contest section where I have different cards for different contest, and maybe I can create this navbar as a separate component too. This enables creating separate component, and at the same time several teams, several people can work on this component. Now, not only the styling part, the functionalities, styling, everything can be separately created for this website. Now, this is what component based application is. This is a parent child relation between the components, which offers data sharing between the components, and all of the components combine and form our UI. Component based application also offers a reusability of code. Means if I want this leaderboard anywhere else or any different pages, I can use the same component at the same place, provided reusability. Now, these can be treated as a separate module. Every component in here can be treated as a separate module. Furthermore, talking about the features, we have TypeScript and ESX support. TypeScript is basically the superset of JavaScript, and which provides a static type checking, interface support, so we can have objects, so we can have complex data structure, and we can implement that to create objects. Native web development, so we can create mobile applications using Android, iOS, using this Angular framework. Now, let's talk about the websites which use Angular. So, since Angular is developed by Google, all of the major Google websites, for example, the Google search engine itself, Gmail, Forbes and PayPal, all of them are based on Angular. Now, this makes Angular very, very popular out there, and there we have a large community support. So, if we are getting stuck somewhere and we want to get a knowledge of Angular, how the things work, we can use it. So, without any further delay, let's have a look at our basic Angular application. So, this is an Angular application, this is a basic Angular application. Now, how is this file loaded? How do we set up our project? That is something we can see in a minute. Although, if I talk about my application, I can see that I have an HTML file in over here. This is the first index.html file, which is the main file of my application, which has some data in. Now, let's render this application and let's see. So, we have this. This is the CLI tool which I use to run my application. We will see about the commands, what commands we use to run our application, how the application runs, and all those things. Now, if I see this is the application which is being loaded, and I see some data in over here. Now, I can check. So, if I just inspect my element, I see that there are several headings. There is a heading tag, then we have this first component, and we have other components in over here. Now, how is this functioning? How is all components combined? That is something we will be seeing in a minute. Let's talk about the basics of the code which we see over here, and what are the files and what they use, what they do. So, here is the TypeScript configuration file, which is the file which exactly tells the compiler to, since our browser only understands JavaScript code, not the TypeScript code. So, we need a compiler or something which could translate my TypeScript code back to JavaScript code so that browser can understand it. We have the TS configuration.js, which exactly tells the rules or the things we want to, or the target JavaScript code which I want to compile my application. Now, this is a README file which is containing how to run a project in over here. Then we have our package.json. So, if you are new to Node.js or package managers, package.json exactly contains all the required modules, which is modules dependencies, which is required for my application to run successfully. You can see that we have Angular animations, common compiler. Then we have router in over here. We'll also talk about routing. Routing offers the feature that I can have separate URLs in my application. Even though it's a single page application, I can separate my complete application in different URLs. Also, moving on, we have this Angular JSON, which is basically containing the configurations for how Angular application will be compiled. We can talk about further more once we are done with, once we get comfortable with our application development. This is editor configuration. Now, the source folder is where we will be spending our most of the time. Source folder exactly contains the templates or the code, HTML code, CSS code, and the modules which holds the function how my component is going to look. If I see here, I have this style file in over here, which is the only style file. We can add some styles to it. Then we have this main.ts file. Main.ts file is the first file which gets run when we start our Angular application. Now you see that it is running the app module in over here. So we can check it out. What is an app module? We see there are several imports in here exactly calling different parts of code for building an application. This is what modularity is. We have code somewhere in a different file, and that code can be reused as many times as we want. This is the main index.html file, and this is the only index.html file which is containing the structure of my page, the HTML, body, and the head tag. Rest of the whatever template or component we make will only focus on a separate component of my page. For example, if I want to have the sidebar in my component, so I will just create the sidebar, not the complete HTML head or body tag. If I want to create the main section, so I would be only focusing on creating the main section, including the heading tag, the paragraph tag, and creating these cards. The same goes for the navigation bar too. Moving on, we have the asset folder, which exactly contain the images, the public files, for example, images, JavaScript file, CSS file we want to serve to the browser. Next comes the app folder. App is the first component. Okay, we just said that the components are the building blocks of our application. Component contain an template, an HTML template, along with a functional code which is used to feed data or insert data into that template, and will also define what are the components which is linked to our app component. The app component can be considered as a root component, in which is the first component which gets mounted. All other component in our application will be coming or will be exactly is attached to this main app component. Let's see what do we have in this app template. I see that I have a single h1 tag, and there is something called as first component, which just seems like an HTML code, but that is not an HTML code. So it seems like that is an HTML tag, but that is not a HTML tag, which we will see what this tag is doing. Next is our component.ts file, which is containing some information about my component. The first thing is the selector. Selector is exactly the name of the tag which I will be using in order to add my component or represent my component or add my component to this index.html. So this the app root is the same thing I have used in over here, the same tag which I am using in over here. So the selector or the name of component which I will be using to attach in my index file or any other component is provided in selector. Along with that, the template, basically the template contains the HTML code, the required HTML code, where we feed our data or we set our data in order to create a separate component. Now for example, this app component have this app.component.html, which we need to mention in the template URL itself. Along with this, we have this style URL, which is having the CSS or denotes the CSS, We can have multiple CSS loaded for this component. Finally, there is a class. In this class, we have variables or the data members or the functions which I want to use in my component. For example, if I want to render this title in my website, in my page, I can simply use it in over here. How to do this? I can, instead of having this, I can write the title, which is basically the variable present in over here. Now, I can make these changes in my component file and I can represent it over here. I can say that app component title and I will see that this has been represented app component title and the same will be visible at this point. Let's remove this part and let's check our page. Is the h1 tag representing the title I want? So I see that app component title is replacing the previous title which we had in over here. Okay. Where is this all things coming from? Let's have a look. There are several other components which I have created. If I go through them, this is the first component I have created. A component mostly requires these three files, whereas one of them is a template file with component.html tag. This holds all the things, all the data or the UI part which is required, including the variables or the function calls based on the event listeners. If I talk about this first component, I can see that I have an h2 tag which is having any heading variable. Now we just saw where is this data coming from. So we have this component imported. Now this component is what we call as a decorator. Decorator provides functionality to existing object, functions or classes. So this component decorator is saying that this is not a normal class, this is an Angular component and to offer or include different functionalities in this class. You can see that there is a heading string which holds our first component. Along with that, we see a method in over here and we see that there is another method which is setting up some variable. All these methods and tags can be directly used in our template. Moving on, let's do some changes and we see that how this thing works. So if I want to use a variable, or let's say that I want to create the complete thing again, so how can I do it? Now, I can say that this is a heading. I can say that using the title from the same application. So I could have used this heading or we can create a new one. So I can say that if there is an h1 tag, so you can directly write an heading over here. Now this heading would be exactly replaced by the heading whatever we supply in over here. I can instead of having objects, I can also have I can have array elements. Even I can try to have functions in over here. So if I go through functions, so here's the button. I want that this heading should be changed based on the button. Now this thing is also totally possible. So for that, I'll say click and I can define the function in over here. So the function I want to run is the change heading function and I can run it over here. I can say change heading. And I can write the name change heading in over here. So we can see that based on this button click, I would be able to change my heading successfully. So let's do this. So for the same variable, I will say this dot heading and this is the first component and the heading should be changed to this. Let's see if that is being happening. So I have this first component in over here. Now if I say change heading, I can see that there is a change in heading. So whatever things we use in over here, whatever functions or variables we use in over here is the exact replication of what we already have in our module. So module is exactly sending the data based on our template, like what should our template be holding, and that is what our template shows. Furthermore, we also see that there are several other files present in over here. So in our app component, we do have a test script already present. Now testing is required to test our complete module and if they are following the functionalities exactly or not. I can add CSS style to my application too using the CSS file. So that, for example, if I want to have color to my heading, I can simply supply this color over here. So I can say that this color and maybe any other color I want to provide. This is something I want you guys to see. If I come in over here and I do need to include the style URL in over here. Moving on, let's see how is the component linked to one another. This is the exact HTML file which is holding the structure. Now, we have this app root component in over here. App root is the main component which I am having. Now, this name data which I am supplying to the component can be received and used in our component too. Furthermore, this is the exact app component. Here is what we are having the first component. This is exactly the parent-child relationship, and we can see how components are being used one by one in order to build the complete application. Now, an example of Angular website can be this Angular documentation itself, where we see that I can go to different URLs and I won't see a refresh over here. So it seems like this is a single page application. I can switch between the pages without refreshing the page. So this is an example of how a single page application works. The tutorial contains all the things starting from the basics of Angular, TypeScript and all that. Although we'll be covering all details one by one in our lecture 2. So with that being said, we can further make changes to our component and check how things function. So let's create another component and let's try to use it in our application. In order to create a new component, I can create a separate folder. I can say that I can name the component as, let's say, my first component, my first app. Let's say the component name is my app or my component. The folder would be containing 3 separate files. The files start with one template, which is basically holding the HTML syntax. So my component.html. So the naming convention we try to follow for component is this. Now, apart from this one, we also create a style for this component. So we'll say my component dot style. Apart from this one, we have my component dot module dot ts. I can add an heading in over here, or maybe instead of heading, I can go with div. That's it. This div can be saying this is the my component. And over here, the module contains the class, and we can see how the classes function. So let's call the component directive from Angular. This will be containing several things. For example, the selector for my component will be my dash component. Apart from this, I would also be having the template URL. The template URL is basically the location of my file exactly. So I will say my component Make sure the naming is correct. Component.html. If we have an style URLs, so I can supply the style URLs too, which will take my component dot component.css. Furthermore, we'll be creating a class. The classes mostly holds the same name as component. Now, I can hold different variables. For example, I could also hold an array, and I can use the array in my component too. So we just saw how we used a string, let's say a heading string in my component. Now, instead of heading, I can use any JavaScript type to have in an application. Maybe I'm having array of, let's say, names. Inside the name array, I can have different components, and over here, I can say that, let's say, coding, and then we have ninjas. The names array can be used inside an application. Also, I need to create a constructor in over here. So let's create a constructor. Now having this names in over here. Now, I can directly use this name array inside my component in order to render the strings. I can say this is an UL element. Inside this, I can have LI elements where I can exactly render my names array. So I can say names 0 and names 1. So the same would be applicable in over here. Now, we see that the component does not affect our current application because we didn't call it any or didn't include in any further component, any existing component. Let's try to add this component inside my app component. So this thing we require is the selector itself. So let's copy the selector and use the same in over here. The order can be anything. I can go with this one and I can have my component. But before I do, I see that there is an error. It says that this component is exactly not found. I need to import my component in my app module in order. Now, since we have already made our first component, which is the my component, and we have exported this. Now, this component can be imported in any of the already existing component. If I want to include it in my root component, I can declare in over here. Also, I already added the selector in over here, but in order for the selector to work, I need to provide the declaration that I want to use the my component in my application. I can see that things has been auto imported and I have my components in over here. Now we see that the my component thing along with the heading, I see these two list elements which are exactly the names array coming from the component or the module.tsy of my component. Now you can exactly see in the browser that I have this my component along with the two strings or the elements which have been included in over here. Now this is our first component which we created, and this is how we create building blocks of our Angular application. Furthermore, we'll try to see what are the other ways to pass data from our module file to our UI application, and we'll also see how we can share data across the component in coming lectures. So thank you so much for this. Time, and let's meet in the next session with some cool and interesting features of Angular.